The crystal chandeliers of the Harrington estate sparkled magnificently over the heads of Boston's elite, casting prisms of light across the marble floors of the grand ballroom. Outside, the Atlantic waves crashed against the rocky New England coastline, but inside the only sound was the gentle murmur of conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter and the delicate clink of champagne flutes. Lily Morgan moved discreetly between the guests, her simple black uniform a stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos surrounding her. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her station as one of the newest members of the Harrington household staff. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her green eyes, remarkable for their unusual shade, remained downcast as she collected empty glasses on her silver tray. "More champagne, Mrs. Harrington?" she asked softly, approaching Victoria. Harrington, the lady of the house whose neck and ears glittered with diamonds that caught the light with every movement. Victoria waved her away with a manicured hand. "Not now," she said dismissively, turning back to her conversation with the mayor. Lily nodded respectfully and continued her rounds. Across the room, a distinguished man in his early 50s observed the exchange with interest. Maxwell Reynolds adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, his steel-grey eyes never leaving the young server. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features that stirred long-buried memories. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it?" remarked Senator Collins beside him. "Victoria Harrington certainly knows how to throw a charity gala." Maxwell nodded absently. Indeed, the Coastal Preservation Foundation should receive substantial funding tonight. His attention returned to the young woman as she disappeared through a service door. Maxwell had only returned to Boston 3 months ago after building his technology empire in Silicon Valley. His company, Reynolds Innovations, was valued at billions, and his return to the East Coast had sparked intense speculation in business circles. Few knew his true reason for coming back, a mysterious letter suggesting that what he'd believed for 20 years might be a devastating lie. The evening progressed smoothly until a shrill cry cut through the elegant atmosphere. "My necklace! My emerald necklace is gone." Victoria Harrington stood in the center of the ballroom, her hand clutching at her bare neck where moments before a stunning emerald collar had rested. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Victoria, whose face had flushed an angry red. "Everyone stay where you are," commanded Richard Harrington, stepping forward to support his wife. "Security, seal the exits." Whispers rippled through the crowd as black-suited security personnel moved to the doors. Victoria's eyes darted frantically around the room until they landed on Lily, who was returning with a fresh tray of champagne. "You!" Victoria's accusation rang out, silencing every whisper. "It was you. The new girl who's been hovering around." "Me all evening?" Lily froze, the color draining from her face. "Mrs. Harrington, I—" "Search her," Victoria demanded, pointing a trembling finger. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. Security guards approached Lily, who set down her tray with shaking hands. As one guard reached for her arm, the other began to pat down her pockets. The assembled guests watched in uncomfortable silence. "Please, I didn't take anything." Lily's voice trembled, but she stood straight, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. Then, from the guard's hand came a small velvet pouch. He opened it and gasps filled the room as he tipped the contents into his palm. The missing emerald necklace glittered under the chandelier light. "I didn't—" Lily's protest was cut short by Victoria's triumphant exclamation. "Thief, how dare you? After we gave you a chance." Victoria's voice rose hysterically. "Get her out of my house." The security guards gripped Lily's arms, beginning to drag her toward the exit. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to maintain her footing. "Please, I'm innocent. I never took that necklace. Someone must have planted it." Lily's pleas echoed through the ballroom as the wealthy spectators watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. From the corner of the room, 16-year-old Sophia Harrington observed the scene with an unreadable expression, twisting a ring on her finger nervously. Maxwell Reynolds stood rigid, his knuckles white around his champagne glass. There was something about the young woman's eyes as she looked around the room in desperation, something that struck him to his core. "This is quite the entertainment for a charity event," remarked Senator Collins with distaste. Maxwell set down his glass. "Excuse me," he said curtly, and began moving toward the commotion. But he was too late. The security guards had already forced Lily through the main doors and out into the cool September night. The heavy oak doors closed behind them with a definitive thud. Victoria Harrington cleared her throat, attempting to regain her composure. "My sincerest apologies for this unfortunate incident. Please, let's continue our evening. The orchestra will now play, and I invite you all to enjoy the dance floor." As if on cue, the string quartet began to play, the gentle melody a jarring contrast to the scene that had just unfolded. Maxwell found himself standing near Richard Harrington, who was straightening his bow tie as if nothing had happened. "Unfortunate business," Richard commented, noticing Maxwell's attention. "You simply can't trust the help these days. We hired her on the recommendation of some teacher or other. Clearly a mistake." "Indeed," Maxwell replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Tell me, what was the name of the young woman?" "Morgan, I believe. Lily Morgan. Why do you ask?" Maxwell maintained his composure with practiced ease. "No particular reason. Just curious about who to avoid hiring for my own household staff." But behind his calm exterior, Maxwell's mind was racing. Morgan had been his wife's maiden name, Catherine Morgan, who had taken their daughter away 20 years ago. The daughter, he'd been told, had perished alongside her mother in a tragic accident. The daughter whose eyes had just looked into his, pleading for help. The October rain pelted against the windows of Lily's small rented room in South Boston. 3 weeks had passed since the Harrington incident, yet each night she relived the humiliation in her dreams. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the classified section of the newspaper, every circled job prospect crossed out in angry, red ink. "No one wants to hire a thief," she muttered, tossing the newspaper aside. Despite her impeccable references from the Brighton Home for Girls where she'd grown up, the stigma of the accusation had spread quickly through Boston's wealthy circles. She had applied for 17 positions and received 17 rejections, some more polite than others. Lily tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and moved to the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The room was sparse but clean, a single bed, a small desk, and a dresser topped with her few possessions. Among them stood a framed photograph of a smiling woman with eyes identical to Lily's. "I'm trying, Mom," she whispered to the photograph. According to Sister Agnes at the orphanage, Lily's mother had brought her to the Brighton home when she was just 2 years old, explaining that she was too ill to care for her child. She had left the photograph and promised to return when she recovered. A month later, news came that Catherine Morgan had succumbed to her illness. Of Lily's father, nothing was known, except the gold wedding band her mother had left with Sister Agnes, a ring Lily now wore on a chain around her neck. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Lily, are you decent? It's Mrs. Winters." "Just a moment," Lily called, quickly wiping away a tear and straightening her simple cotton dress before opening the door. Eleanor Winters stood in the hallway, her 70-year-old frame slightly stooped, but her blue eyes sharp and kind. She held a steaming mug in her weathered hands. "I brought you some tea, dear. Chamomile with honey helps with sleep." "Thank you," Lily said, accepting the mug gratefully. Mrs. Winters had been a godsend, renting her this room at half the going rate after hearing Lily's story at the community center, where they both volunteered. "Any luck with the jobs?" Mrs. Winters asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Lily shook her head. "I've applied for a position at the public library. They're not connected to the Harrington crowd, so maybe—" Mrs. Winters' face softened. "Something will come along, dear. You're too good a person for this cloud to follow you forever." She paused, hesitating. "Actually, I may have heard of something. My nephew works security at Reynolds Innovations, that big tech company that just opened headquarters downtown. They're hiring administrative staff, and he mentioned they don't care much for Boston's social gossip." "Reynolds Innovations?" Lily's eyebrows rose. "I've heard they pay well, but I don't have experience in corporate settings." "You're smart and a quick learner. The posting says they're looking for entry-level positions." Mrs. Winters patted Lily's hand. "What have you got to lose?" The next morning, Lily stood before the gleaming glass tower of Reynolds Innovations, her resume clutched in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The October sky had cleared, and weak sunlight illuminated the modern structure. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the revolving door into the sleek lobby. "I'm here about the administrative assistant position," she told the receptionist, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Fill these out and wait for Miss Davis," the receptionist replied, handing her a tablet with digital forms. Lily had just completed the forms when a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s approached. "Ms. Morgan, I'm Helen Davis, HR Director. Please follow me." The interview room was minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of Boston Harbor. Helen Davis was efficient and direct, asking pointed questions about Lily's skills and experience. To Lily's surprise, there was no mention of her previous employment with the Harringtons. "Your background is unusual," Ms. Davis noted, reviewing her resume. "Raised in Brighton Home for Girls, associate's degree in business administration from Community College, various service positions. I understand I may not have the typical corporate background," Lily began, preparing for another rejection. Ms. Davis held up a hand. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds specifically instructed us to look beyond conventional resumes. He believes diverse backgrounds bring fresh perspectives." She smiled for the first time. "And frankly, your test scores are exceptional." Hope fluttered in Lily's chest. "Does that mean—" "We have a final round of interviews this afternoon with Mr. Reynolds himself. Can you return at 3? Across town, in his penthouse office, Maxwell Reynolds studied the background report on his desk. The private investigator he'd hired had been thorough, tracing Lily Morgan's history back to her arrival at Brighton Home for Girls. The timeline matched perfectly. She had been placed there just weeks after he'd received news of the accident that supposedly claimed his wife and daughter. Maxwell closed the file, memories flooding back. He had been building his first company, working 18-hour days. Catherine had taken their 2-year-old daughter to visit her parents in Maine, frustrated by his absence. Their argument before she left had been bitter. 2 weeks later, he received the devastating call. A car accident, no survivors. He had identified Catherine's body, but their daughters had supposedly been too damaged for viewing. In his grief, he hadn't questioned it. He had left Boston that same month, unable to bear the reminders of his loss. Now, 20 years later, evidence suggested his daughter might be alive, might be the young woman he had seen humiliated at the Harrington Gala. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Reynolds, your 3 o'clock interview is here." Maxwell straightened his tie. "Send her in." The door opened, and Lily Morgan stepped into his office. Up close, the resemblance to Catherine was even more striking. The same determined chin, the same graceful hands. But it was the eyes that convinced him beyond any doubt. Those unique green eyes that seemed to shift between emerald and jade depending on the light. "Ms. Morgan, please have a seat," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Lily sat, her posture perfect, hands folded in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Reynolds. I understand you're interested in joining our administrative team," he began, studying her face. "Yes, sir. I know my background is unconventional, but I'm a quick learner, detail-oriented, and I work extremely hard." The earnestness in her voice was unmistakable. "Tell me about your last position," Maxwell said carefully. A shadow crossed Lily's face. "I worked for the Harrington family as household staff. It didn't end well." "I see. And why is that?" Lily hesitated, clearly weighing her response. "I was accused of stealing a valuable necklace. I didn't do it, but they found it in my pocket. Someone must have planted it there." "That sounds like a difficult situation," Maxwell said neutrally, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "It was. And now I can't find work in any household in Boston." Lily raised her chin slightly. "But I won't let that define me. I'm more than one false accusation." Maxwell felt a surge of pride at her resilience. "Ms. Morgan, I believe in second chances. Or perhaps in giving people the first fair chance they deserve. Hope flickered in Lily's eyes. Does that mean... You're hired, Maxwell said simply. You'll start Monday as my executive assistant. Executive assistant? But I applied for an entry-level position. I have a good instinct about people, Miss Morgan. I believe you'll exceed expectations. Maxwell stood, extending his hand. Welcome to Reynolds Innovations. As Lily shook his hand, Maxwell felt the weight of 2 decades of separation. His daughter was alive, standing before him, unaware of their connection. Now he had to find a way to uncover the truth about the past without losing her a second time. By late November, Lily had settled into her role at Reynolds Innovations with surprising ease. The corner office on the 48th floor offered breathtaking views of Boston's skyline, a stark contrast to her humble room in Mrs. Winter's house, which she had insisted on keeping despite Maxwell's generous salary offer. Mr. Reynolds needs those Morgan contract revisions by noon, Helen Davis reminded her as she passed Lily's desk. Already on his desk, Lily replied with a smile. She had quickly earned a reputation for efficiency, anticipating Maxwell's needs before he voiced them. Her relationship with her boss remained professional, but had grown increasingly comfortable. Maxwell was demanding but fair, taking time to explain complex business concepts and including her in high-level meetings where most executive assistants would be excluded. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an unreadable expression, but she attributed it to his famously analytical mind. Meanwhile, across town, the Harrington estate was in turmoil. Richard Harrington paced his study, a glass of scotch in his hand. Another loan denied, he growled, throwing the rejection letter onto his mahogany desk. That's the 3rd bank this month. Victoria Harrington sat rigidly in a leather armchair, her usual confidence replaced by worried tension. I don't understand. We've always had excellent relationships with the financial institutions in this city. Something's changed, Richard muttered. It's like someone's poisoning the well. First, the coastal development project stalls because of suddenly concerned investors. Then our usual backers start ghosting us. Now even the banks are turning their backs. Could it be connected to the Reynolds return? Victoria suggested. The timing seems suspicious. Richard scoffed. Maxwell Reynolds? Why would he care about us? He's in tech, not real estate. In the doorway, Sophia Harrington listened silently, twisting her charm bracelet, a nervous habit she'd developed recently. At 16, she had her mother's blonde beauty and her father's shrewd eyes, but lately those eyes had been shadowed by secrets. Sophia, darling, Victoria called, noticing her daughter. Weren't you supposed to be studying for your SATs? I needed a break, Sophia replied, entering the study. Dad, is everything okay with the business? Nothing for you to worry about, Richard assured her, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. Just a temporary cash flow issue. Sophia hesitated. Is it because of that girl? The one accused of stealing Mom's emerald necklace? Victoria's expression hardened. Of course not. That incident is long forgotten. Is it? Sophia pressed. Because I heard she's working for Reynolds Innovations now, as Mr. Reynolds' personal assistant. Richard and Victoria exchanged alarmed glances. How do you know this? Richard demanded. Sophia shrugged. Emma's father works there. He mentioned it at dinner last week when I was at their house. Richard set down his glass with deliberate care. Interesting coincidence, isn't it? Our former maid landing such a prestigious position immediately after being dismissed for theft. Perhaps we should reconsider our position, Victoria suggested quietly. If Reynolds has taken an interest in her, we are not retracting the accusation, Richard cut in sharply. The necklace was found in her pocket. End of story. Sophia bit her lip, looking as if she might say something more, but instead turned and left the room. Later that evening, at Reynolds Innovations, Lily was finishing up the quarterly reports when Maxwell emerged from his office. Still here, Ms. Morgan, it's nearly 8. Just making sure everything's ready for tomorrow's board meeting, Lily replied, stifling a yawn. Maxwell studied her for a moment. You've been an exceptional addition to the team. I'd like to invite you to join me for dinner to discuss your future with the company. Startled by the unexpected invitation, Lily nodded. That would be lovely, thank you. They dined at an upscale restaurant overlooking the harbor, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. Maxwell ordered wine and encouraged Lily to select whatever appealed to her from the menu. Tell me about growing up at Brighton Home, Maxwell said after their appetizers arrived. Lily looked surprised by the personal question, but answered openly. It was too structured. The nuns were strict but kind, especially Sister Agnes. She made sure I got an education. And your parents? Maxwell asked carefully. Lily's expression turned wistful. My mother brought me there when I was 2. She was ill and couldn't care for me. She promised to return, but she touched the chain around her neck where the gold wedding band lay hidden beneath her blouse. Sister Agnes told me she passed away a month later. I'm sorry, Maxwell said softly. And your father? Unknown. Just another sad orphanage story. Lily attempted a smile. But I've made peace with it. We can't change the past, only build our future. Maxwell nodded, his throat tight with emotion. A wise philosophy. As dinner progressed, their conversation turned to business, with Maxwell outlining a potential promotion that would give Lily more responsibility in community outreach programs. You seem surprised, he noted, observing her expression. I am, Lily admitted. Most people in Boston still view me as a thief. You're the only one who's given me a real chance. Perhaps because I see more clearly than most, Maxwell replied enigmatically. On the other side of the restaurant, unnoticed by either of them, Sophia Harrington sat with a group of friends, her attention fixed on Lily and Maxwell's table. When her friends became engrossed in conversation, she slipped away, approaching Lily as she returned from the restroom. Lily, Sophia called softly, startling the older woman. Lily tensed immediately. Sophia, what are you doing here? The teenager glanced around nervously. I need to talk to you about what happened that night. I have nothing to say to any Harrington, Lily replied coldly, moving to step around her. I hid the necklace, Sophia blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily froze. What? I hid Mom's emerald necklace and planted it on you, Sophia confessed, her eyes filling with tears. I was angry because they wouldn't let me go to Switzerland with Jason for winter break. I wanted to get back at Mom, but I never meant for you to be accused like that. Lily stared at the girl, a complicated mix of vindication and anger washing over her. Do you have any idea what you did to me? How you ruined my reputation? I'm sorry, Sophia whispered. I've been trying to tell Mom the truth, but she won't listen. And now Dad's business is in trouble and everything's falling apart and it's all my fault. Before Lily could respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. Sophia Elizabeth Harrington, what are you doing? Victoria had appeared beside her daughter, her face tight with anger. Mom, I was just harassing our former employee, after all. The trouble she caused. Victoria gripped Sophia's arm. Apologize to our friends for your rudeness, we're leaving. But Mom. Now, Sophia. As Victoria led her daughter away, she cast a venomous glance back at Lily. Stay away from my family. Shaken, Lily returned to the table where Maxwell waited, his expression concerned. Everything all right? You look pale. Lily hesitated, then decided to trust him. That was Sophia Harrington. She just confessed to planting the necklace on me. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. Did she now? And what did Victoria have to say about that? She wouldn't let Sophia finish. She dragged her away. Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. The Harringtons are very protective of their image. They destroyed my reputation to protect theirs, Lily said bitterly. Perhaps, Maxwell agreed, but truth has a way of surfacing eventually. He raised his wineglass. To justice, delayed, but not denied. As they clinked glasses, Maxwell made a mental note to accelerate his plans. It was time the Harringtons faced the consequences of their actions, not just for what they'd done to Lily, but for the deeper deception that had robbed him of 20 years with his daughter. Across the restaurant, Eleanor Winters observed the scene her presence unnoticed by either Lily or Maxwell. The elderly woman's eyes lingered on them with a knowing expression before she quietly paid her bill and slipped away into the night. December blanketed Boston in white, transforming the city into a picturesque winter wonderland. Inside the warmth of her small apartment, Lily gazed out at the swirling snowflakes, nursing a cup of hot chocolate. Her conversation with Sophia Harrington 3 weeks ago had left her with mixed emotions, vindication mingled with lingering bitterness. The soft knock at her door broke her reverie. "Come in, Mrs. Winters," she called, recognizing the familiar pattern. Eleanor Winters entered, carrying a worn, leather-bound box. "Thought you might want some company, dear. The snow makes the old bones ache, but it's beautiful, isn't it?" "It reminds me of the Christmases at Brighton home," Lily mused. "Sister Agnes always made sure we had at least one gift each." Mrs. Winters settled into the armchair by the radiator, placing the box on her lap. "How are things at Reynolds Innovations?" "Surprisingly good. Mr. Reynolds has been—" Lily searched for the right word. "Supportive. Different from any boss I've ever had." "Maxwell Reynolds has always been an interesting man," Mrs. Winters remarked casually. Lily looked up sharply. "Do you know him?" Mrs. Winters smiled enigmatically. "Boston is smaller than it seems, especially for those who've been here a long time." She patted the box on her lap. "I've been meaning to give you something." "What is it?" "A memory box. From a long time ago." Mrs. Winters opened the box and removed an old photograph. "Do you recognize this woman?" Lily took the photo with trembling hands. "That's my mother. I have the same picture." Her brow furrowed. "How do you have this?" "Because I was there when it was taken." Mrs. Winters' blue eyes held Lily's gaze steadily. "I was your nanny, Lily, from the day you were born until you were 2 years old." The mug nearly slipped from Lily's hands. "My nanny? But how? Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to be sure it was really you. After all these years." Mrs. Winters reached for Lily's hand. "I recognized you the moment I saw you at the community center, but I couldn't simply blurt it out. What if I was wrong? What if it reopened old wounds?" Lily's mind raced. "You knew my parents? Both of them?" Mrs. Winters nodded, removing more photographs from the box. "Your mother, Catherine, was a kind woman, strong-willed, passionate about her art. And your father—" She paused, studying Lily's reaction. "Your father was ambitious, driven. They loved each other fiercely, but they had their struggles." "My father," Lily whispered. "Is he— did he—" "He's alive, Lily." Mrs. Winters laid out more photographs. A younger Catherine Morgan in a wedding dress, arm in arm with a tall, dark-haired man whose face was partially obscured. Lily leaned closer, heart pounding. "Why didn't he come for me after Mum had passed away?" Mrs. Winters sighed deeply. "It's complicated. There was an accident. Your mother took you to visit her parents in Maine. On the way back, the car went off the road during a storm. Your mother was injured badly, but you were miraculously unharmed, protected by your car seat. But Sister Agnes told me Mom brought me to the orphanage before she died." "She did." Catherine was terrified. "Of what?" "Of your father's reaction." Mrs. Winters' expression grew somber. "They'd had a terrible fight before the trip. Your father was building his first company, working day and night. Catherine felt neglected, invisible. She threatened to leave him, take you away. When the accident happened, she saw it as a sign." "A sign to abandon me?" Lily's voice cracked. "No, dear. A sign to give you a fresh start, away from what she saw as a toxic environment. Catherine believed your father would never give you the attention you deserved. She told him you had died in the accident." Lily gasped. "She lied to him? Made him believe his daughter was dead?" Mrs. Winters nodded sadly. She was injured, frightened, and not thinking clearly. By the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. Your father had identified her body after she passed away from complications and left Boston grief-stricken. He disappeared from public view for years." Lily stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "All this time I thought I was unwanted, abandoned, but my father thought I was dead." Tears welled in her eyes. "Who was he, Mrs. Winters?" What was his name? Before the elderly woman could answer, Lily's phone rang. She ignored it, but it rang again immediately. "You should answer," Mrs. Winters said gently. "We have time to talk." With a frustrated sigh, Lily checked the caller ID. "It's Mr. Reynolds, I should take this." As Lily spoke briefly on the phone, Mrs. Winters carefully returned the photographs to the box, except for one, which she placed on the coffee table. A clear image of Catherine Morgan with her husband, Maxwell Reynolds, holding infant Lily between them. "I have to go," Lily said after ending the call. "There's an emergency at the office. Mr. Reynolds needs me right away." Mrs. Winters rose slowly. "We'll continue this conversation when you return. The box will be waiting for you." Across the city, in the Harrington mansion, chaos reigned. Richard Harrington slammed his fist against his desk, face purple with rage. How could this happen? Hostile takeover of our company? Victoria paced the room, her designer heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "How much have we lost?" "Everything," Richard growled. "Every subsidiary, every major project, strategic acquisitions over. The past 3 months all leading to this moment. Someone's been playing a long game. Who has the resources and motive to do this?" Richard's expression darkened. "The board meeting is in an hour. We'll find out then." Sophia stood silently in the doorway, watching her parents' world crumble. The weight of her secret pressed down on her, but another worry had begun to overshadow even that guilt. "Mom," she said quietly, "I found something in Dad's study." Victoria turned impatiently. "Not now, Sophia." "It's about Lockwood Heights," the teenager insisted. "The community displacement plans, the falsified environmental reports." Richard's head snapped up. "You've been going through my files." Sophia stepped back, alarmed by her father's tone. "I was looking for my passport, but Dad, those documents, what you're planning to do to those people." "It's business, Sophia. Adult matters you couldn't possibly understand." "I understand that it's wrong," she replied, standing her ground. "And I think someone else knows too, someone with the power to stop you." At Reynolds Innovations, Lily rushed into Maxwell's office, slightly breathless from her hurried journey through the snowy streets. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Reynolds?" Maxwell stood by the window, silhouetted against the cityscape. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, especially in this weather." "Of course. What's the emergency?" He turned to face her, his expression solemn. "In 1 hour, I'm attending a board meeting at Harrington Developments. Today I become the majority shareholder of their company." Lily stared at him, struggling to process his words. "You're taking over the Harrington business? Why?" Maxwell gestured for her to sit. "Harrington Developments has been engaging in unethical practices for years, displacing vulnerable communities, falsifying environmental reports, bribing city officials. I've spent the last 3 months gathering evidence and strategically acquiring their assets." "This is about more than business ethics, isn't it?" Lily asked perceptively. Maxwell studied her for a long moment. "Yes, it's also about justice. For what they did to you. Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate your concern, but I want you to attend the meeting with me," he interrupted. "It's time the Harringtons faced the consequences of their actions, and I believe you deserve to witness it." Lily felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication, confusion, and an inexplicable unease. "Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me." Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, vulnerability briefly replacing his usual confident demeanor. "Perhaps I know you better than you think, Lily." Before she could question him further, Helen Davis entered with a stack of folders. "The files you requested for the Harrington meeting, sir." "Thank you, Helen." Maxwell straightened his tie. "The car will be ready in 20 minutes, Lily. I suggest you prepare yourself. This will be significant." The Harrington Developments. Boardroom hummed with tension as Maxwell Reynolds and Lily entered. Around the mahogany table sat 12 board members, with Richard and Victoria Harrington at the head. Their expressions shifted from surprise to barely concealed hostility at the sight of Lily. "Mr. Reynolds," Richard greeted stiffly, "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing..." additional personnel. Ms. Morgan is my executive assistant, Maxwell replied smoothly, guiding Lily to a seat beside him. She's instrumental to our operations. Victoria's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the table. Let's get this over with. You've called this emergency board meeting. The floor is yours. Maxwell nodded, his demeanor calm but resolute. As of this morning, Reynolds Innovations owns 57% of Harrington Development's shares, making us the majority stakeholder. He paused, allowing the statement to sink in. We will be implementing immediate and significant changes to the company's operations and ethical practices. Murmurs rippled around the table. Richard's face flushed crimson. This is preposterous. How could you possibly... It was all perfectly legal, Richard, Maxwell interrupted. Strategic acquisitions, negotiated purchases from nervous investors, and a significant number of shares from your own sister, who was quite concerned about the direction of the family business. Victoria's gaze darted between her husband and Maxwell. What changes do you propose? Maxwell opened a folder. First, the immediate cessation of the Lockwood Heights development project. The environmental reports were falsified, and the community displacement plans violate multiple regulations. Lily watched the color drain from Richard's face. She felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and discomfort at witnessing the Harringtons' downfall. Second, Maxwell continued, a full investigation into past business practices with appropriate compensation for affected communities. You'll destroy the company, Richard growled. On the contrary, I'll save it from your mismanagement and ethical failures. Maxwell's voice hardened, including your willingness to falsely accuse an innocent employee to protect your secrets. All eyes turned to Lily, who straightened in her chair, meeting their gazes with quiet dignity. That's absurd, Victoria began, but was cut short when the boardroom door opened. Sophia Harrington entered, clutching a familiar velvet pouch. Sophia, what are you doing here? Victoria demanded. The truth, Mom. Sophia's voice trembled, but remained firm. She approached the table, placing the pouch in the center. I took the emerald necklace that night. I planted it on Lily because I was angry about Switzerland. The room fell silent. Victoria's face contorted with disbelief. Sophia, why would you... I tried to tell you weeks ago, but you wouldn't listen, and then I found Dad's files. Sophia turned to the board. Members, the Lockwood development isn't just unethical, it's illegal. Dad knew the land was contaminated but covered it up. Richard half rose from his chair. That's enough, Sophia. No, Dad, it's not enough. She faced Lily directly. I'm sorry. What I did was childish and cruel, and you suffered because of it. Lily felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. Thank you for telling the truth, Sophia. That takes courage. Maxwell cleared his throat. In light of these revelations, I propose a restructuring of leadership. The Harringtons will retain a 20% stake in the company, but will step down from operational control. The board vote was swift and decisive. Within 30 minutes, Richard and Victoria Harrington had been removed from their positions. As they gathered their belongings, Richard turned to Maxwell with undisguised hatred. This was personal. This wasn't about business at all. Maxwell's expression remained impassive. You're right. It was personal. What did we ever do to you, Reynolds? Victoria demanded. Maxwell glanced at Lily, then back to the Harringtons. That's a longer conversation for another time. As the room cleared, Lily remained seated, trying to process everything that had transpired. Only she, Maxwell, and Sophia remained. Will, you be okay? Lily asked the teenager, who looked both relieved and devastated. Sophia nodded. I think so. It's better this way, even if it's hard. After Sophia left, Lily turned to Maxwell. You didn't just do this for justice or ethical business practices, did you? There's something you're not telling me. Maxwell's expression softened. You're right. There is. And I think it's time you knew the truth. He hesitated. I believe Mrs. Winters may have already started that conversation. Lily's heart pounded. How do you know about Mrs. Winters? Because I've been looking for you for 3 months. ever since I received a letter from Eleanor Winters suggesting that what I'd been told 20 years ago might not be true. The realization dawned on Lily slowly, pieces falling into place. His unexplained interest in her, the job offer, his vendetta against the Harringtons. "Who are you to me?" she whispered. Maxwell's eyes, the same steel gray that had always seemed vaguely familiar, held hers steadily. "I'm your father, Lily." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "My father? But how? Mrs. Winters said my father thought I was dead." "I did," Maxwell confirmed quietly. "For 20 years, I believed I had lost both you and your mother in an accident. I identified Catherine's body, but I was told you were too severely injured for viewing. In my grief, I never questioned it." "Then how did you find out?" 3 months ago, I received a letter from Mrs. Winters. She'd seen me in a business magazine and recognized me. She wrote that she had reason to believe my daughter was alive and living in Boston. The timing coincided with my planned expansion to the East Coast, so I accelerated the move. "And the night at the Harrington Gala?" "That wasn't coincidence." Maxwell shook his head. "The invitation came after I arrived in Boston. When I saw you there, I knew immediately. You have your mother's eyes." Lily struggled to breathe. "So all of this, my job, the takeover, it was all because I found my daughter after 20 years and discovered she'd been mistreated by people who should have known better." Maxwell's voice broke slightly. "I wanted to tell you immediately, but I feared you wouldn't believe me, or worse, that you'd reject me. I needed time to earn your trust." Lily stood abruptly. I need some air." "Of course." Maxwell made no move to stop her. "Take all the time you need." 2 weeks later, as New Year's Eve approached, Boston prepared for its annual first-night celebration. The city sparkled with lights and decorations, a festive atmosphere pervading the streets despite the bitter cold. Lily stood on the esplanade, watching preparations for the evening's fireworks display over the Charles River. The past fortnight had been a whirlwind of emotions as she processed the truth about her origins. Mrs. Winters had shared more memories and photographs filling in the gaps of Lily's early life. "I thought I might find you here," said a familiar voice. Lily turned to see Maxwell approaching, bundled against the cold. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you always loved fireworks as a toddler," he explained. "You would clap and laugh at each explosion of color." A small smile touched Lily's lips. "Some things don't change, I guess." They stood in comfortable silence, watching workers set up barriers along the riverbank. "I've been thinking," Lily finally said, "about what happens next." Maxwell nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "And what have you decided?" "That I can't change the past 20 years, that what happened was tragic but not your fault." She turned to face him fully. "And that I'd like to know my father, if he's willing to be patient with me." Maxwell's eyes brightened with unshed tears. "I have 20 years of patience saved up." Lily hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket, removing the gold wedding band on. "It's chain. Mrs. Winters confirmed this was yours. Mum left it with me at Brighton home." Maxwell took it gently, running his thumb over the inscription inside. "Forever bound in love," he read softly. "I thought you might want it back." He shook his head, placing it back in her palm and closing her fingers around it. "It's yours. A link to both your parents." Lily nodded, returning it to her pocket. "I've been thinking about the Harringtons too. What about them? Sophia didn't deserve to have her life upended because of her parents' mistakes. And even Victoria and Richard deserved the chance to make amends." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting leniency?" "I'm suggesting compassion," Lily corrected. "You've achieved justice. Now maybe it's time for something more." Maxwell considered her words. "You're wiser than I was at your age. Perhaps wiser than I am now." A young woman approached them hesitantly. It was Sophia Harrington, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "Lily, I wanted to thank you for what you did. The board reinstated the college scholarship program for Lockwood Heights residents because of your recommendation." "It was the right thing to do," Lily replied. "How are your parents?" Sophia shrugged. Adjusting. Dad's actually talking about starting a smaller, more ethical company. Mom's volunteering at the community center, partly for image rehabilitation, but I think she's actually enjoying it. Maxwell extended his hand to the teenager. Change isn't easy, but it's often necessary. Your parents are fortunate to have you to guide them. As Sophia walked away, Lily felt a sense of closure. The Reynolds Foundation's community outreach program launches next week, she noted. Our first project will help the Brighton home modernize their facilities. Our project? Maxwell asked, a hopeful note in his voice. Yes, if you still want me as your Director of Community Relations. I can think of no one better qualified. As dusk fell and the first spectators gathered for the evening's celebrations, Lily found herself reflecting on the year's journey, from accused thief to discovered daughter, from isolation to belonging. What are you thinking about? Maxwell asked gently. About how life can change in an instant, Lily smiled, and how sometimes the longest journeys bring us exactly where we need to be. Above them, the first fireworks exploded against the darkening sky, showering the city with cascades of light and color. Father and daughter stood side by side, their faces illuminated by the brilliant display. The past finally at peace, the future full of promise. In Mrs. Winter's apartment across town, the elderly woman placed the last photograph in a new album. Maxwell and Lily at the company Christmas party, their resemblance unmistakable in their matching smiles. She closed the book with satisfaction, knowing that some stories, even after decades of separation and misunderstanding, could still find their way to a happy ending. As the clock struck midnight and Boston welcomed the new year with a spectacular finale of light and sound, Lily knew that while her journey had been marked by loss and struggle, it had ultimately led her home, to the truth, to forgiveness, and to the family she had always sought.